All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Baruch Hashem to begin Sanhedrin, to begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the entire year of Tafshin Pei Hey, the Tilson Mishpacha, dedicating all the Sherman Droshos this year as a zechus for the completion of Maseches Ba Basra, and Emir Hashem, the beginning of the beautiful journey into Maseches Sanhedrin. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for Kislev, Habalin Latova, Josh and Becca Friedman, the creation of the yahrzeit of Josh's father, Yisrael Yehuda ben Arav Chaim Rafael, and in the schus of the safe return of our hostages and the security of all of our soldiers. Semi and Malka Esterson, in memory of their parents, Yitzchak Leib ben Aaron HaKohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram, Hinda Bas Henech Ephraim, and in memory of their dear friend, brave soldier, beloved husband, father, and skilled physiotherapist, Naftali Gordon, Naftalion Hashem Yikom Damo, Ben Beatrice Miriam, and Danielle Yigal. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all of those who need a refuah shav and Teilah Kol Cholei Yisrael, that Rebbe Shalom should return our hostages b'shalom and b'karov, and allow our holy soldiers to be successful b'chol ma'aseh yedehem. Because with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Daf Vav. Daf Vav 6. We are picking up Emir Hashem on Hey Amud Beis. We left off with Pshita, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15 lines up from the bottom. So remember again, we're really in the midst of the riveting discussion regarding essentially how the adjudication of financial cases works. So remember again, one of the things that we've seen also, the dominant thing that came out of yesterday's daf was you can't paskin without permission. No paskening without permission, right? And the idea being, again, now what level of permission you need, how different permissions work. Does Bavel work to Eretz Yisrael? Does Eretz Yisrael work to Bavel? So on and so forth. So that, again, we had that discussion. But the bottom line is, right, Yora, Yadin, Yadin. There has to be permission from some higher authority in order to be able for a Talmud Chacham to paskin on Shilas. So the Gemara says, Pshita lepalga. So the Gemara says, Haka Amar Demahani. So we'll say, so now the Gemara, essentially the question it doesn't ask, but it asks is, can a person receive partial permission? So let's say you have a Talmud Chacham. Can you give permission to Talmud Chacham, let's say, to rule on certain matters and not on other matters? So the Gemara says, yeah, we actually dealt with that. We dealt with that already, right? Where do we see that? We saw that in yesterday's daf, where Rav was granted permission to go ahead and paskin on Dinei Mamonos, monetary law, Isser V'Heter, matters of prohibition, but what wasn't he given permission about? Bechoros, right? To paskin on the mum of Bechor animals. So we definitely see that there's the concept of granting partial permission. Okay. The Gemara's al Tanai Mai. What about granting permission with a condition? Now, what does this mean? So if you look at Rashi says, Kigon ad shana o ad shnasayim v'lo yoser. This is actually very interesting. Can you give timed permission? In other words, can you say like this, so-and-so Talmud Chacham has the ability to paskin on matters of halacha for the next year, for 2 years. So it's not just like it's not a blank check. There's a time. Does that work? So Tashman, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shimon. So listen to this. Rabbi Yochanan said to Rabbi Shimon, Hari ata birshusenu ad shetavo etzlenu. You are hereby under. You are operating within our rishus until you come back to us. Look at Rashi, Rav Shimon, Kishaya Porish Mimenu V'yar LaBavel. When Rav Shimon left Eretz Yisrael and went to Bavel, so ultimately, Rabbi Yochanan told him, Birshusenu Rishus Nesunu L'Chaladon. You have permission to pass Shilas until you come back. So what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, there is the ability to go ahead and give timed rishus. Timed rishus, you can go ahead and halacha l'maisa give rishus for a certain duration for psak halacha. Incredible. All right, let's go back to Gufa. Amar Shmuel. So Shmuel said as follows: Beis shadanu dinehem din. So Rabbi say, what's the halacha? If two people go, welcome back to Moshe ben Sion. Moshe ben Sion, Baruch haba, Baruch haba. So the Gemara says as follows. So Gufa Amar Shmuel. Beis shadanu dinehem din. If two people go ahead and adjudicate the halacha, then it works. It works. Ella shenikra beis din chatzuf. But Ultimately, again, they are called a chutzpahdik bezin. So we've already seen this already before, like in the beginning of the Masechta, that technically speaking, even if two people go ahead and adjudicate a halacha, technically it works, but they are called a bezin chatzuf, right? They're called a chutzpahdik bezin. Yosef Rav Nachman Mekar. So this is very important because this is going to be a major topic for our discussion today, which is Shmuel holds that mid oraisa, so a bezin of two operates. A beis din of two is a legitimate beis din. However, again, it's called mechutzav, right? They're called chutzpahdik. Why are they called chutzpahdik? Because they're operating in a way that they shouldn't be operating. In other words, ideally, we have three dayanim. The fact is they're going ahead and they're operating with two. This is not ideal, and therefore it should not be done. But technically speaking, it works. Yosef Rav Nachman, the Ka'amar L'Hashmaita, so Rav Nachman was sitting over and giving over this ruling. Eisvei Rava L'Rav Nachman. So Rava raised the kasha of Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman was quoting Shmuel that a beis din of two works, but it's called a mechutzav, right? They're called chutzpahdik. So Rav Nachman was giving over this ruling in front of Rava, and Rava raised the kasha. Afidu shnayim mizakin or shnayim mechayvin. Even if so this is now in a beis din of three. You have two judges who find the defendant guilty, or two judges, right? Afilu shnayim mizakin or shnayim mechayvin. Two judges find the defendant guilty, or two judges find the defendant innocent. Ve'echad omer eini yodea. This is very interesting. Very interesting. One judge says, I don't know. Now, both say, what happens effectively when a judge says, I don't know? What happens effectively is that third judge is effectively absenting himself from the judicial process. So what's the halacha? So the Gemara says, Yosifu dayanin. You have to add on a third judge because it's as if that third judge left the panel, right? And therefore you have to add on a third judge. So the Gemara says, 1 second, but why? V'i isa lehavu kishnaim shedanu. But again, if Shmuel is correct, that a beis din of two, technically speaking, works. So although again, I got it, it's not ideal. But when you started with a beis din of three, and two of them say, let's say the defendant is innocent, and the third one says, I don't know, fine, so I'd have to replace the third one. You still have a beis din of two, that's paskening. So this is the Kashan Shmuel. Shiny hasam de meikara adaita de tlasi yasvi. Hacha lav adaita de tlasi yasivi. No, there's a very big difference. When the litigants sit down, and their intention is to be judged by a beis din of three, then you got to close out the process with a beis din of three. And if one of the judges says, I don't know, he's effectively absenting himself from the process. You have a deficient beis din, and now you have to go ahead and fix that, right? That has to be remedied. Masha'enkein, what Shmuel is referring to, what Rav Nachman is referring to, is where a person, the chatchila, sits down with a beis din of two. Okay, so the chatchila sits down with a beis din of two. Technically speaking, that is going to work. Incredible. So we'll say, by the way, there's a tremendous Musar Haskell in this, which is that in life, so a person has to make sure, let me say it differently. We spoke about this before, that there are certain things in life where you don't have to get involved. But once you get involved, you're obligated to see it through. So this dayan sits on a beis din. There's no such thing as ambivalence. You have to take a stand. You have to choose a side. Again, if you don't want to get involved, you have a right not to get involved in certain things. But once you get involved, you can't go ahead and say, I don't know, I don't have an opinion on this. If you get involved, and this is true in life in general, if you get involved in something, see it through. How many times in life do we start to do things, and then again, it gets a little complicated, it gets a little this, it's uncomfortable. So like we decide once we're in to absent ourselves from the process. No, if you want to absent yourself, don't get involved. Once you're involved, you have an achrayus. Once you have a responsibility, see it through to completion. Incredible. All right, 8 So okay, so listen, this is very exciting. So this is really, I didn't want to hype it up too much on the chat, because then people only come for the exciting daf and call it in for the other ones. Every daf is ridiculously exciting, but this is great stuff. So I got to both say. So just to keep in mind, here's what we have. We have a statement of Shmuel and Rav Nachman. Shmuel said it, Rav Nachman echoed it. And what was it? Technically speaking, you could adjudicate a case with two dayanim. Okay, not ideal. You're called the mechutzav, but at the end of the day, technically speaking, it works. Now watch this. Say, today's the kasha. Rabbi Shmuel says, Hadin b'shlosha, adjudication of a case is with 3 dayanim, upshara b'shnayim. Oh, okay. Introduced to something new over here. So we'll say pshara. Pshara. What's pshara? What's pshara? Compromise. Compromise. So the truth is, today you could also, this really is a form of arbitration or mediation, right? Where again, the goal, and we're going to talk about this, that the goal of din versus the goal of pshara are very different. Right? The goal of din is to decide who is right and who is wrong. The goal of pshara, of compromise or mediation, is to decide, it's create some type of equitable compromise. It's understood that pshara is not coming out with who's right and who's wrong. Pshara is, we decide to leave that on the side and we're just trying to figure out an equitable solution. So again, we'll get into this more. So the Gemara says, din, adjudication of a case, is with 3. Pshara is with 2. The yafeh koach pshara mikoach hadin, and pshara is more powerful than judgment. How so? Sheshnayim shedanu balei dinin yecholin lachzor bahen, u'shnayim she'asu pshara because if you are judged by a beis din of 2, you have the ability to go ahead and negate that judgment. But if you did pshara with 2, that's binding. What do you see from here? That din made by 2 dayanim is not binding. That contradicts Shmuel, contradicts Rav Nachman. Top of Vav 6a, v'chi tema pligi Rabbanan leid Rabbi Shmuel Gamliel. So okay, so maybe we'll say the Rabbanan argue Rabbi Shmuel Gamliel. Vam Rabbi Avo shnayim shedanu ledivrei hakol ein dinehem din. But Rabbi Avo says that if 2 people adjudicate a case, again, their judgment is not binding. Contradicts. To which the Gemara says, what are you getting all excited about? Gavra aramis? Okay, it's machlokas. I was going to say, there are different opinions about the effectiveness of a 2-person beis din. Bottom line, that's what it comes down to. So you've got Rabbi Avo who says that a 2-person beis din does not work, and you've got Shmuel / Rav Nachman who say that a 2-person beis din does work. Look at the top Rashi. Gavra agavra, Rabbi Avo ad Shmuel. Shmuel savar pligi rabbanan alei Rabbi Shmuel Gamliel. Fine, so we'll say machlokes. So we'll say this is very exciting. So a lot's happening over here, and it's still so early in the morning, which is, does a 2-person beis din work or not? Rabbi Avo, no. Shmuel / Rav Nachman, yes. Now you've also been introduced to the din of pshara, of compromise. Let's go with that. Gufa. Here we go. I'm Rabbi Avo. I will say we'll get to the halacha l'maisa for all of these things, and Miras Hashem probably tomorrow. So Gufa, I'm Rabbi Avo. Shnayim shedanu dinei mamanis l'divrei hakol ein dinehem din. So okay, Rabbi Avo. This is the Rabbi Avo we just quoted before. If 2 people, 2 dayanim, adjudicate a case of monetary law, everyone agrees that their judgment is not effective. Eisvei Rabbi Avo. So Rabbi Abba is kashet Rabbi Avo. Dones hadin v'zika es hachayiv v'chiev es hazakai time es hatar tir es hatame. So I'll say now listen to this case. In all of these cases, we're talking about judicial error. Judicial error. The judge made a mistake. He exonerated the wrong person. Right? He found he indicted the wrong person. He made something that's tamei, tahar, something that's tahar, tamei. The point is, he made a judicial mistake. So what do you do? Now Rashi says over here, Danas hadin, b'mumcha, lekam so good. So fine. So Rashi says, Danas hadin yechidi. So we must be talking about a yachid mumcha, like we saw in yesterday's daf, a single, an expert, an individual who is an expert. So what happened? He made a mistake. So I will say what happens. So this is interesting in general. What happens when a dayan makes a mistake? So what's halacha? Masha asa asui. What's done is done. The boss say now, what does it mean? What's done is done. We do not reverse the ruling, right? The ruling stands. But 1 second, it's an erroneous ruling. So how do you deal with that? Umeshale mi beso. This is fascinating. The judge himself becomes personally liable. So in other words, the judgment stands. So let's say for example, Reuven came to Beis Din and he claimed that Shimon owed him $1,000. Right? So meanwhile, so let's say the Dayan ruled that indeed Shimon owed Reuven $1,000. And then it turns out the Dayan was wrong. He was just totally wrong. So we'll say, so what's the halacha? The halacha is we do not make Reuven give back Shimon $1,000. That's it. The din stands. But what? The judge himself is personally liable to pay Shimon the $1,000 to make him whole. So there's the judgment stands, but there's personal liability. So the Gemara says, I'll just point out there is something very interesting. Take a look at Rashi just a moment. Now, for our purposes, why is this being brought down here? What do you see from here? You see from here that the judgment of a singular judge is binding. If the judge, and not reversible, if the judgment of a singular judge is binding and non-reversible, then certainly what? Certainly two. So how could Rabbi Avo saying that the judgment of two judges is ineffective? Now, I just want to, before we go, let's go back there. Actually, before we go back there. So understand, this sounds so strange. We know the judge made an erroneous ruling. We know it. So why not reverse the ruling? Because we'll say this goes back to a fundamental yesod. This is about preservation of the sanctity of the system. People have to have faith in the Beis Din system. They have to believe that it's just, they have to believe that it's correct, and they have to believe that people know what they are doing. If you start reversing judgments, it fundamentally erodes confidence in the system. But one second, but if we know that the judge made a mistake, you can't just let that go either. So we balance both of them. The din will stand. Now, not to say, by the way, that there aren't times where we don't reverse the judgment. We'll get to that also. But Lamaisa, in this case, the Musar Haskell is the system is always more important than any individual. This is incredibly, this is what I will say, this is one of the most important yisodos in Yiddishkeit. How many times does it happen that there's a certain halacha that I don't like? Well, let's be honest, we're friends, right? There's a certain halacha that I don't like, or a certain halacha that doesn't speak to me, or a certain halacha that really is a pain. It's a pain. It just does not fit in with the way I want to live my life. So you have a choice. What's the choice? So people could go ahead and people do this all the time. They come up with different hashkafas. It's incredible to see how many hashkafas are created from convenience. Right? They come up with different hashkafas, different ideas. So I will say, Yiddishkeit 101 is you fit yourself to the system. You don't fit the system to you. Rav Shmuel Hirsch brings down by the Cheteg, the sin of the golden calf. He says, what happened over here, right? Moshe Rabbeinu was gone for one extra day. They built a golden calf. So Rav Shmuel Hirsch says something amazing. He says, they didn't stop believing in Kadosh Baruch Hu, but they wanted, the problem with Yiddishkeit they had is Yiddishkeit forces you to mold yourself to the system. They wanted a system that molded it to themselves. He said, Rav Shmuel Hirsch says, what's the difference between idolatry and monotheism? In Yiddishkeit, I have an obligation to make myself in God's image. In Avodah Zarah, in idolatry, I make God in my image. I decide what I want, and I create a system of theology all around that. In Yiddishkeit, there's a Kadosh Baruch Hu, who is an immutable, eternal truth, and my obligation is to make myself in His image. It's one of the hardest things about Yiddishkeit, but it's one of the most beautiful things, and one of the things that is the core reason why we are here for thousands upon thousands of years, which is we do not make the system in our image. We make ourselves and everything else in the systems in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's image. That's what's unfolding over here. So the Gemara goes back to, what's the case over here? So in other words, why is it that you see over here even one judge? It creates a ruling. Now, the case here is where the litigants accepted the ruling of one judge. So we already saw this before, right? If the parties agree to something, then of course it's going to be binding. So if that's the case that they accepted this judge upon them, then why, when it turns out that his ruling was erroneous, why is it that halacha l'maisa, the judge has personal liability? Very interesting. Damrulei, dayanta lan din Torah. Because again, Reuven and Shimon said to the judge, judge us in accordance with the laws of the Torah, i.e., give for us a proper judgment. That's what they signed up for. When it turns out that the Dayan gave them an erroneous judgment, he's going to be personally liable for that. I'm going to start with Rabbi Abba. The Tabamai. So this is very interesting. So let's talk about this in just a moment. So I will say, so first of all, what you see in this case is as follows. Already in yesterday's daf we saw the ability for a Yachid Mumcha, a single expert to judge. Now what we see is if that judge made a mistake, there's personal liability on his part. Now I will say, I know what you're thinking. How does this stem with what we learned yesterday, right? Didn't we learn that if you have permission to paskin, what do you have? immunity, right? You have like malpractice insurance. So again, we'll see how that stems. We'll see how that stems in just a little bit. So the Gemara says, by the way, Ari Lerner, shkoyach on the lids. Is this a new? Oh, okay, great. Okay, that's it. That was the end. Everybody's waiting for more. That's it. Just nice. The Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, what did the Dayan make a mistake about? Right? What was the source of his? What was the source of his erroneous ruling? So the Gemara says, Dvar Mishnah. So what is interesting? So if he just like made a mistake in an explicit halacha, Dvar Mishnah means explicit halacha that he should have known, but he didn't. In other words, we'll say sometimes people just make mistakes with explicit information. V'hamar Rav Sheshes Am Rabbi Ami Tab Dvar Mishnah Choser. So we'll say, this is what we were talking about before. There are certain times in which if your ruling is just so clearly wrong, the ruling is reversed. So for example, if let's say again Reuven and Shimon came to the Beis Din, and let's say again the Dayan made a mistake because he forgot about an explicit halacha. That's what's called the Dvar Mishnah, an explicit halacha. And as a result, he delivered an erroneous ruling. That ruling is reversible. We do reverse that because again, then that's just 1,000% human error, which happens, but such a ruling is reversible. So the Gemara says, "Elo detab shikol hadas." No, so he didn't make a mistake in terms of an explicit halacha. Rather, he made a mistake. I'll say shikol hadas is one of these interesting. Shikol hadas means he made a mistake in analysis. Shikol hadas literally means weighing of opinions. He made a mistake about how to weigh opinions. What does this mean? For example, Gigon Trei Tanai v'Trei the Pligi Adadi v'lo Itmar Hilchasa lo Kimar v'lo Kimar. So we'll say, so now listen to this. So let's say, for example, Reuven and Shimon came to the Dayan, and they adjudicated a case. And the case in question, right, the principle in this case happened to be a machlokes between two Amoraim or two Tanoim, and halacha was never fully decided, right, with one or the other. Right, the or the other. But generally, the consensus is like one of the opinions, right? So in other words, the matter is a source of machlokes. There's not necessarily a definitive or clear ruling in one, but again, common practice is in accordance with one of those opinions. But the dayan paskin like the other opinion, the one who does not get the common consensus. So what's the halacha? Hainu shikol hadas. So we'll say that's an example of shikol hadas. So here's an example of where the dayan should have known that common consensus is with one of the opinions, right? He ruled with the other one, so this is going to be a case of personal liability. So we'll say we begin to see a lot of very interesting things over here, right? So if halacha l'maisa, the dayan makes a mistake with a clear, explicit halacha, then the ruling is reversible. If he makes a mistake with what's called shikol hadas, something that's not explicit halacha, but common practice is one way, and he ignored or he forgot about common practice, so the din stands, but he becomes personally liable. Fascinating. To which the Gemara said, maybe this whole thing is a machlokes tonight. What whole thing? Are two judges capable of rendering legal decisions? Can you have a two-person Beis Din? So this discussion between Rabbi Avo and Shmuel in reality is a machlokes tanoim. So I'll say, what do we see? This is incredible. Here we go. Bitzua b'shlosh divrei Meir. So Rabbi Meir says bitzua is another word for pshara, for compromise, mediation. Bitzua is done with three dayanim. Rabbi Meir says, say pshara biyachid. No. So compromise, the process of compromise can even be done with one dayan. I will say, I'll point out over here, Rashi says bitzua is pshara, is a compromise. Interestingly enough, Rabbi say that lashon of bitzua, of being compromised, actually we're going to see comes from this past week's parsha, Yehuda, mabetza, what do we gain by going ahead and killing our brother Yosef? L'chuvinim karnali yishmeilim, let's go and sell him. So again, we're going to get to that. Rabbi say, but I will tell you also, the fact that you have two different words in the same line for pshara, just keep it in mind. We'll see why that is in just a little bit. So bitzua, again, so just so you know, bitzua and pshara mean the same thing. A process of compromise, process of, we'll call it mediation, as opposed to find an equitable solution, as opposed to din, judgment. So again, machlokes. So Rabbi Meir says even pshara needs 3. The Chacham say no, pshara can even be done with 1. So savruah dekoli am makshinim pshara ladin. So we assume everyone compares mediation to adjudication, and the Gemara says, what's the machlokes? My lab hakam iflagi. So what's the machlokes? The mar savar din b'shlosha, umar savar din b'shnayim. So maybe the machlokes are both say, since we're comparing, right, mediation, compromise to adjudication, what's the machlokes? One says din is with 3, and therefore pshara is also going to be with 3, and the other says din is with shnayim. Lo dekuli alma din b'shlosha. Nope. Everyone agrees, all of these opinions agree that adjudication requires 3 dayanim. So what's going on here by Pshar? The mar savar makshinim pshar ladin, umar savar lo makshinim pshar ladin. So we'll say, what's the machlokes? The machlokes is, do we compare the process of mediation to adjudication or not? And obviously, again, the results of that machlokes will also determine how many judges or how many people you need for pshara. So lema tzlasa tonight b'pshara. So we'll say, so maybe the need for 3 dayanim is a machlokes by pshara. The mar savar b'shlosha, mar savar b'shnayim. One says you need 3 judges for pshara. The other opinion says you only need 2. Umar savar b'yachid. So we'll say, I'm sorry, lema tzlasa tonight b'pshara. Let's say that there are 3 opinions when it comes to pshara. One opinion says you need 3 dayanim. One opinion says you need 2 dayanim. And one opinion says you only need 1 dayan. No, not really, because the opinion that says you need 2 dayanim for pshara would also agree that 1 would suffice. So why does he say that you need 2? So Rabbi say there's a godless of having 2 people for pshara. What's the godless of having 2 dayanim, 2 judges for pshara? They could also serve as witnesses to the mediation process as well. It's very interesting. Fine, so the Gemara says as follows, Amar Rashi, Shmamina. So I'll say, what do you see from here? Pshara ina tzricha kinyan. So you see from here that pshara doesn't require a kinyan. Now, what does that mean? Pshara doesn't require a kinyan. So here's what's interesting. So let's say Reuven and Shimon have a dispute. They decide that they sign up for pshara, mediation, not adjudication. And by the way, we'll say that's a right they have to have. In other words, when I have a legal dispute with someone, we have to choose: do we want din or do we want pshara? What? There are 2 different processes. Which process do we want? So assuming that Reuven and Shimon go ahead and they go in for mediation, they go for pshara. So now, interestingly enough, at the end, when the ruling or agreement is reached, the Gemara says, now, you see from here, you don't need a kinyan. You don't need a kinyan. Now, I would have thought that perhaps the way that arbitration works is we finish up the agreement, right? We finish up the ruling, right? We come to the compromise, and now the parties have to do a kinyan in order to accept upon themselves the ramifications of that ruling. So the Gemara says, you see from here that pshar doesn't require a kinyan. Why? These are like kinyan. Last one's the daf, because if you thought that pshar needed a kinyan, leman da'amar tzricha tlasa lamali tiski betreva likmimine. Then why would you ever need 3 people for pshara? Just let there be 2. Then let the parties do a kinyan and let those judges be witnesses on that kinyan. And shalom Yisrael, then everything is done. To which the Gemara says, v'hilchasa pshara tzricha kinyan. And this is not the case, but in fact, again, we're going to see that pshara always requires a kinyan. So just to point out over here, din doesn't require a kinyan. Why doesn't din require a kinyan? Because din is part of a formal legal process. And the Torah gives us halachas that say you have to listen to judgment. Pshara is different, and therefore we're going to see that in order for the ruling of the pshara to be, or the agreement of the pshara to be binding upon the parties, they have to do a kinyan. Again, like a kinyan sudar, right? Taking a handkerchief, lifting it up, acquiring upon themselves all of the obligations outlined in the pshara agreement. So again, I will say, but again, like I said, we have a lot of outstanding issues over here. So just to keep track of all the issues, number 1, how many people do you need for a beis din for din, right? Because we moved on to pshara now, but how much do you need for din? Is it 2 or do you need 3? So that's still hanging out there. For pshara, how many do you need? Is it 1? Is it 2? Is it 3? That's still hanging out there. Does pshara require a kinyan? So here, the Gemara seems to say pretty definitively that in order for pshara to work, Pshara absolutely requires a king. And again, we'll see whether or not that's echoed in the halacha or not. So let's go back to a little bit. Tana Rabbanan, Kashem shadin b'shlosha, kach bitzu b'shlosha. So we'll say Braisa. The Braisa says that the same way that adjudication is done with 3, mediation, compromise must be done with 3 as well. Mediation requires a basin of 3 as well. Amud Beis Rabosai, Amud Beis, Nigmar Hadin. So this is very interesting. Nigmar Hadin. Right now, what does Nigmar Hadin mean? Look at the top Rashi, Vav Amud Beis 6b, Nigmar Hadin, Sha'amru Ish Ploni Atazakai, Ish Ploni Atachayev. So literally, the Gemara understands is, if judgment has been passed, so the Beis Din says, Reuven is Chayev and Shimon is Pater. What's Talacha? You cannot then go ahead and resort to compromise, which I will say makes a lot of sense. In other words, if the party that lost the legal proceedings says, you know what, I've changed my mind, I really value shalom. So instead of going ahead and going through a legal proceeding, why don't we try to mediate this out, compromise this out? You can't do that. In other words, once you've gone down the route of din, you can't then revert to pshara. Again, we'll see more about that in just a little bit. So now we get to the core, really like the core and the core issue of pshara, of compromise, and whether or not, how does this work, right? Reuven and Shimon have a legal dispute. What is the proper path for them to take? Is it din or is it pshara? So here we go. Get ready for this. Vavam Beis 6b, second line down. Rabbi Lazar Rabbi Yosei Elili Omer. Rabbi Lazar son of Yosei Elili says as follows: Aser livtsoa. It is prohibited to compromise. It is prohibited to engage in the process of mediation and compromise. Furthermore, v'chol abotzea harei zechote, and whoever goes ahead and compromises is a chote, is a sinner. V'chol mevareches abotzea, and whoever goes ahead and compliments, or literally blesses the compromiser, harei ze menaitz, is a blasphemer. Strong wording. V'al ze ne'emar, and about this the pasuk says, this is the pasuk in Tehillim, botzea berach ni'etz Hashem, which the Gemara is darshaning over here to mean, he who blesses the compromiser blasphemes Hashem. All right, so what do you do? Ella yikov hadin es hahar. Let judgment split the mountain. Shne'emar, ki hamishpat le'elokimhu. Because ultimately justice is right. So I'll say, this is incredible. This is our first school of thought. Now I'll say, our first school of thought is, no. When you have a dispute, what do you do? What do you do? You ultimately go to Beis Din. What does Beis Din do? We'll say, what's Beis Din's job? What's their job? What's their job? To decide who is right and who is wrong. And in every case, there's someone who's right and there's someone who's wrong. See, I will say, what is the fundamental flaw with pshara? What's the fundamental flaw? It's not MS. It's not MS. Pshara is not MS. Pshara essentially says, we're ignoring who's right and who's wrong, and let's find an equitable solution. It's compromising MS. So Rabbi Lazar, son of Rabbi Yosef, says, that's not how we should operate. We should strive for MS. Granted, I will say, does din ensure MS? Does din ensure MS? No. Why? There's human error. But at least din is an attempt to arrive at MS. Pshara is an abdication of the process of MS. Pshara doesn't worry about who's right, who's wrong. Pshara is let's just find, let's just find a nice compromise. So Rabbi Lazar is ideologically opposed to the concept of pshara. I just want to point out over here. Don't misapply this. Like, you know what? I knew this. I've been trying to do this in my marriage all of these years, right? I'm not right. No. Again, just please understand, right? The application of this is purely in legal matters. Do not apply this in the realm of human relationships. That one of my favorite ideas is always the Kutzker, right? The Mishnah says, I've quoted this many times throughout the years, the Kutzker says that one of the miracles that occurred in the Beis HaMikdash was Omdim Sefufim Mishtachavim Revachim. When we were standing in the Beis Hamikdash, in the court of the Beis Hamikdash, everybody was packed in like sardines, right? They were packed in, right, shoulder to shoulder. But yet, when we would bow down, there was room for everyone. So the Rabbeinu Yonah comments on this. He says, "What is it talking about? It's about Yom Kippur. It says miracles on Yom Kippur. Everybody would gather to see the Kohen Gadol. They'd be packed in. The problem is on Yom Kippur, you have to do vidu, you have to do confession. But if I have to do confession and you hear what I'm saying, it's very awkward. So when we would bow down, prostrate ourselves for confession, there was enough room for everyone so that you could confess and not be heard. I could confess and not be heard. Beautiful." The Kotzker says something so beautiful. He says, "Omdim tzefufim." There are some people who always have to be right. They're always right. They're omdim. They stand at their ground. They're always right. What happens with those people? Tzefufim. It's suffocating. It's suffocating. If you happen to know one of those people who is always right, in general, the best thing to do, we know. How do you operate with those people? You don't really engage. You don't really engage. Because the truth is, dealing with them and talking with them and interacting with them is absolutely suffocating. But there's no room for anyone else. But mishtachavim, if you're mevater, if you learn how to yield, you learn how to compromise, you recognize that most things are not worth the fight. And it's so much more important in life to be happy than it is to be right. And so you're willing to go ahead and just yield, revachim. There's plenty of room for everyone. So I just want to point out that when we speak about this, Rabbi Yosef Elili is so stark, Rabbi Lazar is so stark, that there's no pshara. Understand, this is the realm of legal matters. And Rabbi Lazar feels that in the realm of legal matters, there's a right and there's a wrong. There's an emes, there's a sheker, there's a tamid, there's a tar, there's a kasher, there's a treif, there's a chayib, there's a zakai. Don't give up on that process. That's why Hakadosh Baruch Hu gives us that responsibility to find that clarity. And pshara, by definition, abdicates the responsibility to find clarity. He says, watch this. He goes on and he says, V'chei Moshe, Haya Omer Yikov Adines Hayar. Moshe Rabbeinu was the one who said, "Let justice split the mountain." In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu was the one who said that, again, there should be emes. Moshe is a man of emes. Aval Aaron, on the other hand, what was Aaron? Aaron, Oiv Shalom v'Rodev Shalom, right? So Umesim Shalom bin Adam L'Chalera. Aaron, on the other hand, I will say, was a person who loved peace, pursued peace, made peace between man and his fellow. Shneimar Toras Ames Haisa B'Fiu v'Avla Lo Nimtza B'Svasav B'Shalom uB'Mishar Halach. So we'll say this is essentially Moshe and Aaron. Aaron was a pshara man. Moshe Rabbeinu was Yikov Hadin Es Hahar. So we'll say, so by the way, it's very important to also understand, by the way, who was in charge of the legal system? Who was in charge of the legal system? Moshe Rabbeinu. So we'll say, so as beautiful, again, let's say Aaron, fantastic. Aaron was a man of the people, right? Aaron was the mashkiach of Klal Yisrael. He was the mashkiach. Moshe Rabbeinu was the Daina Emes, right? Moshe Rabbeinu ultimately, again, was in charge of the judicial system. So Aaron, you bring your pshara to the conduct of the general populace, absolutely. But as a legal system, ultimately, again, it's got to be Moshe Rabbeinu who runs things, and Moshe Rabbeinu says, "Let judgment split the mountain." That's the expression. Yikov Hadin Asahar. Let the judgment split the mountain. Do not run a legal system based on pshara, but rather run a legal system on finding emes. But it's interesting to see about say, Machlokes the brothers. Machlokes in the brothers, right? Moshe Rabbeinu Yikov Hadin Ashar and Aaron HaKohen Oiv Shalom, Rodev Shalom, Umesim Shalom and Adam L'Chaver. Aaron HaKohen loved peace, pursued peace, and made peace with Hebrews. I often quote this as well, which is this idea. It's also Mishnah Avos. This is what Hillel says: "Having me Talmid of Aaron, be a disciple of Aaron, Oiv Shalom and Rodev Shalom." And the Maharal says on this Mishnah, he says, obviously, why does it have to say pursue peace? Just say love peace, and normal people are lovers of peace. Well, what's the idea? So the Maharal says something so beautiful. He says, okay, everybody loves peace, right? Normal people love peace. But he says, what's the challenge? The challenge is to pursue peace, right? Because if peace comes to me, I'm happy to have it. I'm happy to have it. But to run after it, to make the necessary sacrifices for it, that most people are not willing to do. that was unique about Aaron. Not only did he love peace, but he pursued it. He was willing to make the necessary sacrifices to make shalom in his life. Incredible. All right, let's go weiter. Rabbi Loza says, so now they're just darshaning the pasuk before Botzeach Berach Nietz Hashem a little bit different here. But Loza says as follows: so Rabbi Loza says, imagine the following scenario. Or Rabbi Loza, sorry, right? Ruvain steals wheat, he grinds it up, right? He bakes it and he separates challah. So that's beautiful, right? You think to yourself, that's beautiful. He separated challah. Only one problem. What is he separating challah from? What is he separating it from? From stolen wheat. So Kate said mevarich. So you'll say, maybe he should make a bracha. Laha bracha tashon kirma lachala mashay kisham sav tzivano. Laha frish challah mina isa. Right? He should go and make a bracha. Separate gvaldik. The Gemara says no. The Gemara says Kate mevarich ain't mevarich ela minaitz. This is not called the bracha. Rather, it's called the act of verbal blasphemy. Va'zeh ne'emar ubotzei beirach ni'etz Hashem. This is what the pasuk means when it says that the person, right, the person who stole, now we'll say in this context, the usage of botzea means theft. That's why, by the way, I just want to point out to you how interesting this is, that the same word for theft is also used for compromise. Botzea, right, bitsua and botzea. Now, why is that? Why would you use the same? Because if you think about it, by the way, so compromise is going to sound strange, is a shtickle theft, right? Why is it a shtick theft? Why is it a little bit of theft? Because at the end of the day, you are going ahead and removing something that may belong to someone else and giving it to a different party. In other words, everybody's agreeing to that process, but Lamaisa, again, Ruvain may be right, Shimon may be wrong. The property may really belong to Ruvain, and what you're doing through compromise is you're taking part of Ruvain's part and you're giving it to Shimon. So I just want to point out, remember we saw before that there are two different words for compromise, pshara and bitsua. So you're going to see, by the way, depending on which word you use, that shows how you feel about the pshara process. Using the lashon of pshara sounds like pshara is l'chatchila. Using the lashon of bitsua sounds like pshara is a b'diavad. Again, we'll see how this plays out. In any event, all Rabbi Elazar is doing is, since the Yom quoted this pasuk, Rabbi Elazar is just using a different application. So Rabbi say this is also what we call mitzvah haba ba'avera. It's very nice that you want to separate achala. It's beautiful. Only one problem: you stole the wheat. And such a bracha like that is not a bracha, but it's rather an act of blasphemy. Rabbi Meir says, Lo ne'amar botzeya ela kineged Yehuda. Okay, but it's incredible. Rabbi Meir says, Lashon of botzeya is really said ultimately again by Yehuda. What happened by Yehuda? Shene'amar vayomi Yehuda alechav ma betza ki naharog es achinu. Right? So Yehuda said, why should we kill our brother? Rather, what did Yehuda say? Yehuda said instead, let's sell him. Right? Why should we go ahead and kill him? Let's just go ahead and sell him. So the Gemara says, listen to this. So both say, look at Rashi just a moment. Kineged Yehuda, shahaya lomar nachsirenu la'avinu achari shahaya dvarav nishmam la'achav. What should Yehuda have done? Yehuda should have said, guys, cut it out. That's what he should have done. He should have said, Chevra, stop it. I know we all tremendously dislike Yosef. In fact, we all hate Yosef. But this is not what we do. And Yehuda should have taken responsibility and should have returned Yosef back to his father. So the Gemara says, so Yehuda says, Ma betza. Now understand what it's fascinating. So Yehuda is trying to make like a compromise. Chevra, you want to kill Yosef. I'm saying let's compromise. Let's not kill him. Let's instead sell him. And the Gemara faults Yehuda for this compromise. Listen to this. The Gemara says, V'alzen ne'emar botzea beirach nietz Hashem. About this, the pasuk says, if you praise Yehuda's compromise, you are blaspheming God. Meaning, the Gemara is holding Yehuda tremendously culpable for his decision. Yehuda, you had the right, you had the power to bring Yosef back home. You had the power to go ahead and shut this whole thing down. But instead, you struck a compromise with the brothers. And the Gemara says, whoever thinks that Yehuda did something good is blaspheming HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now I will say there is much to say about this, but I will say, but the Ishbitzer says something absolutely amazing. Again, we don't have time to get into it, but the Ishbitzer says like this. He says, but give Yehuda a break, right? Yehuda was just trying to navigate a complex situation. And says the Meshulach, says the Ishbitz, there's something absolutely amazing. When you know that something is right and something is wrong, you have no right to equivocate. When it's clear to you what the right thing is, you have no right to try to appease the parties. You have to step in and you have to do what is right. There's a place for pshara, and sometimes in life it's not clear what's right and what's wrong. But when it is absolutely clear what's right and what's wrong, you have no right for pshara. You have no right to equivocate. You have an obligation to step in and to do what is right in that moment. And for that reason, the Gemara says, Yehuda, you knew. You knew, you had an understanding what was supposed to be done, and you failed to act in a responsible way. And because of that, again, the Gemara says, Botzea Berach, whoever gives Yehuda shkayach for mediating a compromise, Nietz Hashem. That's the act of blasphemy. That's not compromise. That's not compromise. That is a shirking of responsibility. And I will say, this is so incredibly important, right? Because so often we find ourselves in situations like this, where there's a dispute, and you want to be friends, want to maintain friends with, we want to remain friends with everyone. And I will say, life is really not about having friends. That's actually not what it's about. Life is about doing the right thing. And when you see a situation in which MS is being so profoundly corrupted, you have to worry much less about people remaining your friends and worry much more about ensuring doing your part in maintaining MS in this world. It is such an incredibly important yisod. And also, by the way, you see a theme. Remember we saw in yesterday's daf that you're not allowed to paskin in front of your Rebbe, right? Except in one situation. When are you allowed to paskin in front of your Rebbe? Remember when? Remember again the case of the Kohen in the cemetery? When you see someone doing something wrong, you have an obligation to step in. I've got my Rebbe's right here. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. When it comes to matters of Israel, when it comes to right and wrong in this world, you got to step in and make a difference. Yehuda, you had the ability to step in and make a difference, and you didn't do it. How often in life do we have the opportunity to step in? It's not comfortable. It's not comfortable. But to step in and to right a wrong, that becomes a moral obligation. Incredible. Rabbi Shmuel ben Karcha says, we will say this is the other side of the coin. Now remember again, a few lines ago, we're doing Rabbi Lazar, the son of Rabbi Yosei leading. Now, Rabbi Lazar holds that pshara is essentially aser, right? Not essentially, is right? Aser livtsoa. Comes along Rabbi Shmuel ben Karcha and says, mitzvah livtsoa. Wow. Both say opposite end of the spectrum. Rabbi Shmuel ben Karcha says, it is a mitzvah to compromise. A mitzvah for pshara. Shenemar emes umishpat shalom shaftu b'sharechem v'alo b'makom. So we'll say, so now, because he quotes over here the pasuk, quotes over here the pasuk from Zechariah, and the pasuk says as follows: Emes umishpat, right? So literally again, truth and justice, shalom and peace, shaftu b'sharechem, adjudicate in your courts. So the Gemara says it doesn't make any sense. V'halo b'makom sheish mishpat in shalom. Now the assumption is like this: the Gemara is making the assumption that mishpat is din and shalom is pshara. So how can you have both? How can you have adjudication and mediation, right? How can you have justice and compromise? This is beautiful. Rather, we'll say, how do you ever have a case of mishpat that also has shalom? Right? How do those two things go together? This is compromise. This is compromise. So I will say it's interesting that in Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha's worldview, so pshara is really a form of mishpat. See, up until now we've been looking at mishpat and pshara as two distinct things. There's either mishpat or there's pshara. Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha says no. Pshara, right, compromise is a form of mishpat. Essentially there's like two tracks of din, two tracks. There's absolute justice, din, and then there's pshara din, but they're both tracks of justice. Incredible. V'chein b'David who Omer, so by David HaMelech said as well, Vayhi David osem mishpat utstaka. David HaMelech performed acts of mishpat and staka. V'alo kol makom shish mishpat in staka, utstaka in mishpat. 1 second, once again, I would assume that mishpat and staka are exclusionary terms, right? Mishpat means strict justice, and tzedakah means, tzedakah, acts of kindness. So aren't they mutually exclusive? Ella, ezu mishpat sheish bo tzedakah. So we'll say, so what is the case of mishpat that has tzedakah in it? Have you Omer? I would say zebitzua. This refers to compromise. So I will say this is incredibly important. So what we begin to see over here in Rabbi Shmuel ben Karcha's worldview is that pshara is a mitzvah, but it's also because he views pshara differently. He doesn't view pshara as an abdication of din, but rather he views pshara as a different form of din. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Asan l'tanakama. So rather, again, this would go according to the Tanakama. What does Tanakama say? Here we go. Danas hadin, person adjudicated a case. Zika es achayiv v'chiyev es zika es hazakai v'chiyev es achayiv. So if the judge exonerated the innocent and found culpable the guilty, the Russian is chayiv ani mamon, or he went ahead and he saw V'shilem lo mitoch beso, and let's say again the judge realized that he went ahead and he made a poor person chayiv money. So in other words, he ruled erroneously against the ani, and then what happens? V'shilem lo mitoch beso, and the judge paid back the pauper. The pauper was adversely impacted by judgments from his own money. Zeh mishpat u'tzedakah. This is called mishpat and tzedakah. Mishpat lazeh, it's mishpat for one, and tzedakah for the other. Mishpat lazeh she'echser lo mamon. Ultimately, again, it's mishpat to the one ultimately again who was given the money. U'tzedakah lazeh she'shilin lo musoch beso. And ultimately, again, tzedakah to the one who the judge himself made whole. So the Gemara says as follows: Kashilei l'Rebbe. I've skipped the parenthesis. Because v'chein b'David who Omer. So we skip the parentheses. The Gemara says Kashilei l'Rebbe. Third to last of the short lines. Kashilei l'Rebbe. Hay l'chol. But according to Rabbi, why does it say l'cholamo? It should say la'aniyim, to the poor. Rather, even though the dayan did not pay back from his own money, it's still mishpat and tzedakah. How so? Mishpat lazeh, utzedakah lazeh. Mishpat lazeh shechser lamamono. It's mishpat to the one who was given back his money that was erroneously taken from him. Utzedakah lazeh shahotzi gzela mitachas yado. And ultimately, again, it was tzedakah for the one who stole the property and now had it extracted from him. Incredible. So what was I? So bottom line over here, we find a fundamental machlokus between Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Yoshua about pshara. Rabbi Lazar is saying pshara is asr, and you have to instead go with din. Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha saying pshara is a mitzvah, and you should always go with pshara. What's at the root of this machlokes? It would appear that Rabbi Lazar holds that pshara is a process outside of normal adjudication, and therefore one should really not deal with it. And Rabbi Yoshua ben Karcha saying, no, pshara is another track of adjudication, and therefore ideally should be used. I will say just a couple of more lines. Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe will say the first of the intermediate wide lines. Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe says as follows. This is incredible, beautiful Gemara. Rabbi Shimon ben Menashe Omer, Shnaim shebo lefanecha, l'din. So we'll say if two people, Reuven and Shimon, show up before the dayan, ad shelo tishma divrehen, o misha tishma divrehen v'iyata yodea, lehechan din nota, ata rashay lomer lahen su'u ubitzu. So we'll say this is fascinating. If the litigants come before the dayan, and the dayan either didn't hear their respective sides, or heard their arguments, but really doesn't have clarified in his mind at all which way this is going to go, he has a right to say to them, Chevra, I think you should go to mediation. I think you should compromise. Misha tishma divrayin v'ate yodea lehechan adinota but however, once the judge hears their respective opinions, and then what? And also knows, has a little bit of clarity in his mind, some clarity in his mind as to which direction this should go, he cannot send them to mediation. In other words, we'll say, essentially, once the process of judgment, of din has begun, as manifest by the fact that the judge already has a little bit of a vision in his mind where this case is going, he cannot recommend pshara. Before it becomes crystallized or even semi-crystallized in his mind, he can recommend pshara. Shnei polter mayim reishes madon v'lefana eskala hariv natosh kodim shnei eskala hariv. So the Gemara dashes this before before the dispute becomes crystallized, you could push them off to pshara. But once again, the dispute has become revealed. In other words, the judge has some level of clarity as to which direction this should go. Ultimately, again, you cannot go ahead and push it to pshara. We'll say, incredible Gemara. We're going to stop over here for today. Again, we're not finished. A lot more on this topic. And about to say, obviously, we have to see halacha l'maisa. Litigants come to Beis Din. So first of all, again, all of our outstanding questions. How many judges do you need for Din Torah? How many judges do you need for Pshara? Ultimately, again, does Pshara need a kinyan? But the overarching question is, two people show up in Beis Din. What are we directing them towards? Are we directing them towards din? Are we directing them towards pshara? Is pshara lechatchila? Is pshara b'di'eved? Is pshara a mitzvah? Is pshara an avera? Should we be like Moshe? Should we be like Aaron? What should we do? To be continued tomorrow. Shkach will say. Right. All right, have a great day, everyone.